The story begins with a boy and a girl who were enemies since childhood, and 10 years have passed since then. They were constantly actively involved in state-level conflicts, and now as adults. The moment came when they fought against each other, with the girl on the losing side. After the first defeat of her life, she refused to make any comment, and almost fainting in her final moments, she wanted to be alone. The girl realizes that because of the strongest wound, she has no more than a few minutes left. But even in this state, she accepts it and does not regret anything, because this is her fate. Thanks to her professionalism, she doesn't know what shame or non-acceptance of such situations is. Suddenly, she very clearly began to hear someone's footsteps. But is it really approaching her the same winner, because of which will have to die at any moment? He silently began to move closer and closer, and it seemed that this would be the hardest conversation of all time, because it was about her life, which, soon enough, would not be returned. In that case, she has no choice but to watch and respond with dignity to anything he does or says. But why he needed to see her and what he intends to say to her for the last time is very difficult to understand, because it is not known what you can expect from this man. I just hope the reason he's in this room isn't to hurt the girl or to make himself look superior by winning. At that moment, he's already entered the room. But surprisingly, he looks quite different than the girl imagined it to you. He doesn't have a single joyful emotion. On the contrary, he is obviously upset about something or regrets some action, which is likely to be connected with the death of his enemy. As suddenly he turned to Beatrice, and at that moment the girl was anxious to hear some word from him. It was very funny to her that the guy called her by her name for the first time, because before, they hated each other so much, they addressed each other, not by name at all. After this, Beatrice inquired what was the matter with him, and why he did not rejoice in victory, for he had dreamed of it and of the destruction of his enemy all his life. The girl expected to see a sinister smile, or at least unpleasant words from his side. That was what she had gotten used to all this time. As suddenly he continued to look into her eyes, moved a little closer and said the girl's name again. It seems like she's about to either confess something or just apologize for her rash act that cost her her life. The lad was not afraid to admit that Beatrice was the most worthy opponent he had ever fought against. Although before, he never said anything like that, and on the contrary, he constantly lowers her self-esteem to make the girl feel worse than she really is. He had never succeeded, for Beatrice knew she had always been, and would always be one of the best, to whom there could be no equal. You can't imagine how hard it is for her to look into the eyes of a man who spent his whole life wishing her nothing but bad things. No sad look or apology on his part can bring back a life that could be cut short at any moment. Though the girl was able to accept her defeat with dignity, she will never forgive him for being the man who made it all happen. The most frustrating thing is that you can't turn back the clock and make a choice that you won't regret and be in that situation. Beatrice, such a strong and fair person that even though she was in such a difficult state, she congratulated him on his victory. She was surprised she'd said those words to him, because she thought she'd never do it, and even if she did, it would be very difficult. I'm sure it could have been very different. All you had to do was discuss this understanding and find a compromise. It is possible that Beatrice could have claimed to be his personal knight, and her life would not have ended so early. But unfortunately, there is no way to turn back the clock and fix the mistakes and problems they chose to ignore in this way. It didn't lead to very good consequences, and only now they could see it and regretted not thinking about it earlier. At the last seconds, Beatrice too decided to confess something to him and did not conceal what really. She had always considered him a worthy adversary, and she enjoyed every battle together immensely. Unfortunately, they were only now finding out that it was all mutual, noticing that the girl's eyes were starting to close. He touched her shoulder to somehow bring her back to consciousness and prolong this conversation, but apparently it was already too late. Beatrice managed, from the last of her strength, only to whisper that she held no grudge against him and wished him only good things. And after that, she said goodbye and finally left this world. And anyway, she did it in a very dignified way. The indifferent face of her enemy was the last thing she saw before she drew her last breath. But just a moment later, she saw the silhouette of a man in a blur, and heard an unfamiliar voice address her as mistress. And after that, this voice invited her to breakfast, where His Majesty was waiting for her. But what did it all mean? Could not be. Beatrice was alive. She felt it very distinctly, and realized that the sensation was distinctly different from that which she had expected. It seems we're going to have to sort through everything and find out where she's gone, who she's become, and what happens next. The first thing the girl did was look around the room and happened to notice a mirror nearby, and at that moment, the most interesting thing happened. She saw her new appearance. In the reflection, she saw a pretty girl with pink and long hair, very different from what she was in her past life. Beatrice immediately got out of bed, for she was insanely curious to examine her appearance up close. It's just an incredible moment that's just impossible to believe and understand how it could happen. She never imagined that something like this would happen in her life, where a new life, a new world, and more awaited her. In any case, the only thing left to do is to accept what has happened and get used to the incredible changes, which are like a dream or a fairy tale. Looking around and examining the room a little more closely, the only thing that becomes clear is that some princess used to live here. And most likely, her life should be just as bright, pleasant, beautiful, and fulfilling as this gorgeous room. Meanwhile, her assistant couldn't help but notice her mistress's surprise and reaction after seeing her reflection in the mirror. She began to wonder what exactly had surprised her so much, and why the girl was reacting as if she didn't recognize herself in the mirror. In the beginning, because I couldn't think of anything except that maybe the girl had a dream, and that's why she's acting like this. At this point, Beatrice decided that as strange and suspicious as it sounded, she should ask what was going on here. Namely, she asked to answer a few questions that her assistant will hear for the first time in her life. As soon as the girl asked her name, the question elicited the reaction she expected. And not surprisingly, despite the strange situation, the girl still managed to find out her name was Emily, and also that it's in a known kingdom. Afterwards, the assistant offered to be her personal guide for a time, until the mistress's memories were fully restored to her. It turns out that this small state has very fertile soil, and consequently, there is an abundance of farming. No matter what you plant here, it is sure to grow and bloom, and in general, it is responsible for supplying fresh produce to the entire local community. According to the assistant, with such rich lands, their kingdom is unrivaled and the best in the business. Accordingly, Emily concluded that she had come to a very quiet place, and at this point, decided to find out what year it was. This question sounded even stranger than the previous one, but still, the assistant does her best to let the girl know the answers to all her questions, because that's her job. She has to do and say absolutely anything the mistress asks her to do and say. It turns out that this is the year her 20th birthday is coming up, which she's been looking forward to for a long time. When she heard this information, she had an unusual feeling, because before she could not even imagine that after death, she would enter a new reality. She had only recently been in a different world and was a completely different person who had already come to terms with doom and had no hope of anything like it. It is very interesting to see what we can expect next, and what fate has prepared for her this time, because so far, Emily has only had time to get acquainted with her appearance. It is possible that, having such a beautiful appearance, a girl must have many suitors and a very interesting life, which should be much safer and more pleasant than the one in which you had to risk your life before. In the meantime, it was time for the assistant to ask questions, for she was just as curious to know what was going on. She doesn't understand what caused this behavior and how mistress can explain it, if she wants to, of course. In response, Emily didn't bother to hide anything from her, and judging by the fact that the assistant was relatively calm about the situation, the real mistress of this body wasn't known for her stylish intellect, which means that even asking such questions, it did not arouse any suspicion, and the assistant was surprised by only one thing. The girl behaves too calmly and practically does not resent anything, and at some point she happened to remember that she had originally come to tell him that His Majesty wished to have breakfast with Emily. As there was no time left at all, and not to keep him waiting long, they went at once to get the girl cleaned up. Surprisingly, but just a little while ago, when she was Beatrice and saw her enemy before her, the girl was sure it was the end of the But as it turned out, it was not only the end, it was the beginning of a new life, which should be much better and more colorful than the previous one. She still doesn't understand how she was magically reborn into another body and is going to meet a man she doesn't even know. As soon as she leaves her room, you have to decide whether she's going to keep a low profile or whether she's going to tell everyone what happened. But in that case, if she picks the second option, it's likely she'll just be misunderstood, and that decision will turn out to be wrong. There's a good chance that someone in this world would believe that and not consider her a human being. Meanwhile, the girl has made it out into the huge hallway after all, and is headed for her first breakfast in this body. On the way, she began to admire the beautiful views from the window, and unaccustomed to her own sense of self, Emily, as it turned out, was a very feminine girl, who has nothing in common with Beatrice. They're radically different people, which became very apparent when they got into her body. This world is so romantic and romanticizing, it's likely that her life is. Really hope the girl learns what it's like to enjoy life and not risk it for years to come, which Beatrice did, for which she gave up a life that could have turned out very differently. What's amazing is that all this time, she never stopped thinking about the man she was supposed to hate. Even though he is responsible for her death, the girl misses him and refuses to believe that she will never see him again. Could it be that being enemies, the two of them hid their feelings, and that's why the guy was so upset about his victory? But now's not the time to think about it. And all we have to do is not arouse suspicion, so we don't have to explain anything. She's getting more and more curious about how long she can hide who she really is and how she ended up in this body. No sooner had she greeted her new parents than her father began to resent her lateness, for he took it as disrespect on her part. Emily hadn't expected such a reaction and realized that being in this company wouldn't end in anything good. Luckily, her mom tried to rectify the situation. She explained to Can that there was nothing wrong with it, and even more so, disrespectful. At this point, her sister joined the conversation, saying that if Emily had come a few minutes late, she would have been left without breakfast. And after that, other girls have done it. But who they are to her is still unclear. Judging from the behavior of each of them, Emily concluded that they had not even a sign of royal manners. So it's weird that they're trying to point out her mistakes when they're no better. The girl tried to ignore it after all. She apologized for being late and sat down at her seat. And once the whole family was at the table, her sister offered to continue the unfinished conversation. And judging by her insistence, it's obvious she's more interested in it than anything else. So she offered it at the first opportunity. That's what it turned out to be. The thing is, they never decided which girl would get the Miss Tomato title. It sounded so confident on her part that the other applicants were clearly not thrilled with the statement. It turns out that they've been having the same title conflict for years, called vegetable species. At this point, since the conversation had started, one of the girls decided to reserve the title of potato and warned her not to let anyone claim it. These arguments and conflicts have been going on for so long that some people are sick of discussing it at the table every time for years now. Even though it seems a little strange, since this is a farming family, it's very important and integral to them. Emily imagined the royal family sitting on the edges of a huge table and everyone trying to show off their manners, and these people seated very close together, and have a modest breakfast of tomato soup and creamy spaghetti with unsalted bread and a couple of boiled potatoes. Girl had never seen or imagined a royal table that would look like this. When suddenly the girl had an unexpected thought, for it was possible that, in fact, there are no tomato or potato misses, or sisters fighting over the vegetable title, or parents looking on with a smarmy look at it all. Everything going on in the last few minutes seems so strange that it bears little resemblance to the usual royal family. Emily thought it was all an illusion, and she was still unconscious, for perhaps it could be the prank of some fairy whose duty it was to escort her into this world. In any case, it would all make more sense than that she was now watching this complete. At this point, the woman turned her daughter's attention and asked her why she was suddenly quiet, not eating or commenting on anything. Thus all took notice, and glances did not begin to exhibit her to explain her behavior, for usually Emily is more talkative. The situation had become so awkward that because of the stares of others, the girl began to feel as insecure as possible. She doesn't understand how she can get out of this situation, much less act like the old Emily is in this body. If a girl starts discussing this topic or speaking her mind, someone will definitely suspect something. And yet, once she answered the question and tried to look as serious as possible, the others couldn't ignore it. Everyone started laughing at her behavior, which means that the real Emily is far from being as calm and reserved as the one in her body tries to make her look. After a while, it turned out that for several years in a row, Emily was Miss Peach, and that title belonged to her alone. But nobody explains what it means and whether it is good or bad, so you'll have to figure it out for yourself. Because surely every title must have some explanation, characterization, and prestige. During the conversation, it turned out that the girl got the Peach title because of her hair color and makeup. But it didn't end there. The conversation continued, and the next topic was her marriage, which the girl was obviously not ready for. Her mom wanted to talk about it, but is there a few candidates or guys she knows who are potential husbands? And it's not impossible because she doesn't know much about her life yet, and even less about acquaintances or friends, if there are any. To avoid making Emily feel embarrassed and nervous, her father began to slowly change the subject and made it clear that this was not the best time for this conversation. Watching what was going on, the girl was becoming more and more sure that nothing like this could happen in the real world. She's sure it's a very realistic dream, or something that has nothing to do with real life. At that moment, all at the same time heard some very loud sound, and some of them even got frightened. It came so suddenly that some had a sense of alarm and a startled look of, since everybody heard it, obviously they were not imagining it, but had they never heard such an early? Just a few seconds later, one of the assistants walked in unannounced, and judging by his reaction, he wants to tell them something very important. Everything so serious and unforeseen that he gave no warning and didn't even knock on the door to get permission to come in. It seems that this man is obviously frightened of something or has something very unpleasant to report that his master will not like. In order not to guess and find out everything at once, the man asked not to hesitate and still report the reason why he interrupted the family breakfast. As suddenly, the aide said with horror that in his opinion, in all probability, the sound meant conflict with a neighboring state. No one was prepared for it because on such a beautiful and sunny day, no one had any idea that something like this would happen. And what is most unpleasant is that no one warned or even hinted that such an attack was planned in the near future. Because of this, no one knows how to act properly in this situation and not to make mistakes because of high stress. As soon as the aide told the information he happened to know, Emily seemed to hear a familiar name. There's only one guess whose name made her so surprised, but it seems if it's exactly the person she thought it was, no. Coincidences like that just don't happen. But it seems to be happening, and it's happening right now. The very guy the girl thought of at the first second is heading towards them. But how? How is this even possible? Because this kind of thing only happens in fantasy stories. It turns out that after being killed, reborn into another world and another body, Emily will meet the person who got her here in the first place. Except if he hurts her this time, Emily will never forgive him again. The man she had once known, he was the exact opposite of what he had lately become. He was like the moon. The guy seemed to radiate some soft, serene light that gave an incredible impression of a... Unfortunately, it didn't last long. He became a dangerous man whose emotionless expression made it impossible to see into his thoughts. Man, continually pouring forth his soft but piercing light. The realization that he was her enemy made her conceal the respect she had formed for him. In any case, the only question she wants to know the answer to is just what he needed to attack a neighboring kingdom for, and whether it has anything to do with the fact that it contains Beatrice, whom he knew, and probably still considers his enemy. It's not like the nice guy she used to know and couldn't imagine him capable of hurting anyone. Meanwhile, as the situation was too urgent and required immediate solution and immediate action, the assistant inquired as to their further plan of... Surprisingly, the king was not surprised by this attack, and on the contrary, judging by his reaction, he suspected that such a thing might happen in the near future. Accordingly, was prepared for the enemy's attack, and knows perfectly well what he will do next, for he has every step calculated for such an eventuality. Watching her father smile, The girl mistakenly concluded as if he wasn't serious about the situation and didn't realize how important and dangerous it was. Though really, his smile only means that he is confident that his family is safe and not frightened by such seemingly terrifying news. We can only hope that he is confident in the strength of his kingdom and has not overestimated the capabilities of the defenders who will have to face a surprise attack. It turned out that in this situation, his daughters were interested in something else entirely, namely whether the vegetable nomination was canceled this year. It's a very controversial issue because it's unlikely that anyone would want to break a 200-year-old tradition that hasn't been missed even once. Emily heard this and couldn't believe her ears. She resented the fact that this was the only thing they were interested in at the moment. It is incomprehensible to her how they cannot be afraid, because at any moment, the territory of the kingdom can be attacked by an enemy who couldn't care less about the vegetable traditions that are common at this time of year. According to the girl, normal people in such a situation would tremble with fear, and they are all calm when every next day may be the last one. At this point, she just couldn't stand it and directly decided to ask this question: do they not care about what is happening and the future of the kingdom? Because with a conflict of this magnitude, they are in great danger, and despite their confidence, it guarantees nothing. For as we know, never underestimate an opponent, especially one they will face for the first time in the history of the kingdom. Even more surprisingly, the family didn't take the remark in any way, and it seems they just chose to ignore it, so that the girl would not feel superfluous and unheard. They tried to explain to her that they were not afraid of any enemy. They are so confident of their protection and security that when they hear or notice any doubt about it, they start laughing. Unbelievable how they've managed to keep the peace throughout all this time. Emily isn't sure if things are really as wonderful as they say they are. This time, she tried again to make her point and warn them that their reaction, it wasn't normal. Because usually when it comes to a conflict of this magnitude, which can affect a huge number of people, it causes panic and apprehension, and the reaction of each of them, the exact opposite of what she expected to see after that terrible news. After listening to these words this time, they even praised her for thinking like this and having a responsible opinion on the matter. They're genuinely very pleased to know that she's interested in more serious issues instead of a vegetable title, unlike the rest of us. And she's not thinking about whether she'd like the title of potato or tomato this year like her sisters. They really aren't interested in anything but that. Though perhaps there's nothing wrong with that, since their father is in charge of the kingdom's security, and they have nothing to do with it. They really aren't interested in any problems other than their own, and they are probably right about something after all. And yet, in their sister's opinion, they shouldn't be as indifferent as they appear in this situation. Judging by their reactions, they would be even more overjoyed than they had been before the aide broke the terrible news. In fact, she is very frightened by this reaction of each of them, because if suddenly they are very wrong, they will be in big trouble. As suddenly, when the girl thought that she was no longer surprised by anything, she realized that she was wrong when she heard the conversation of the sisters, who are looking forward to the opponents, because among them, there must be handsome guys. They actually get serious about it and start planning who they'd like to create a relationship with. In that case, Emily realized she was incapable of changing their minds and influencing their attitudes on the issue. She just silently turned around and decided to go about her business. The girl realized that continuing to convince her family of anything was just pointless. And after a while, it was as if everyone had conspired to leave that room at the same time. Apparently, the longest breakfast ever. They of course often linger and discuss some news or problems, but this time it was much longer. In that case, not to alienate everyone, Emily returned after all and decided to follow the others. She is very interested in what each of them does during the day and what their responsibilities or hobbies are. The girl knows nothing about her new family, and now she has the perfect opportunity to find out. Emily never thought she would ever see him again. However, she would soon come face to face with him. It's a big moment, and as it turns out, her whole family was heading outside to meet the so-called guests. The aide opened the door, and in that second, the girl was eager to look him straight in the eye. Because after this meeting, a lot of things will become clear and she will be able to draw conclusions that will help her understand how to react and proceed. In the meantime, there are only seconds left to see if either of them is willing to compromise, or if conflict is inevitable. These people are so close that with every step they take, Emily's excitement and fear grows greater and greater. Unlike the others, the girl has her eyes on only one man on whom the future of the entire kingdom will depend. Because not only does his intentions determine that, but also how Emily will feel about him. Since she has a new look, he won't recognize her. Accordingly, she won't even be able to explain why it's so important for her to talk to this man, since she's just the king's daughter who is forbidden to do so. The thing is, only the king has the right to speak to this man. It would be very strange if one of his daughters started asking him questions in front of everyone. And if he does feel or understand, or when he finds out who's really in this body, if they do want to talk. The only way to do it is to keep it a secret, except it's unlikely he'll ever find out. But for now, it's up to Emily if she decides to hint or try to talk to him. Even the future of the kingdom may depend on it. At first glance, she noticed a few changes in him. The guy had grown noticeably, and now he wasn't at all like the last time she'd seen him. It is impossible to imagine what the girl feels at this moment, because those around her cannot even imagine what happened between these people in the past, or rather, in the past life. At this point, when the king decided to introduce himself and inquire about the man's intentions, Emily barely held back. Not to go up to this guy and talk about all the things she didn't get to say to him that time she thought she'd never see him again. Meanwhile, her sisters, as usual, instead of normal behavior, started admiring his looks and didn't even try to hide it. It's very strange that they don't find this behavior unacceptable, especially in this situation where their lives depend on the person they are trying so hard to please. It's very strange from their side. But Emily is not even surprised by it. She just accepted it and started to think only about her own problems, not noticing anyone around her. She was tired of repeating and proving to everyone that these people were far more dangerous than they could ever imagine. As a friend, the girl happened to notice his gaze, and as soon as the guy smiled, she was already over-controlling herself. She began to dread every look and movement on his part, for there was no knowing what that ambiguous smile might mean. Meanwhile, the moment had come when the fellow did address each of them after the salutation. He said that since he was in a relatively good mood today, so be it. He would give the choice to their king. And after that, he's even closer to it, and it seems like the upcoming choice is going to be one of the toughest of his life. The thing is, looking at the situation from the outside, there's no compromise. The guy came in here with a purpose, and he has no intention of giving it up. But for some reason, he's delaying the moment when he'll tell me what he's interested in. But as it turned out, they didn't have to wait long for that moment, seeing the incredible interest from his entire family. The guy offered him one of two choices: die here and now or team up with him. Judging by the king's reaction, this is not the kind of proposal he was expecting, and at this point, too much may depend on his decision. The guy warned that he hoped the king would make the right choice and not try to resist, just to prove his importance and greatness. I wonder how the man will react, because he can't even roughly imagine how important it is to make the right choice. The complexity of the whole situation is that it is not known what the cooperation is and what benefits each party will receive. And judging by how confident the king was before this conversation, and to maintain that position, he may be making a very big mistake. He's got his whole family looking up to him and their lives depend on him. So it's probably not the best time to seem better than he is. When it comes to safety, there's nothing better than trying to compromise and save as many lives as possible. I really wonder if Emily will get involved in this conversation, and how she'll react to this meeting at all. As suddenly, the girl tried to get his attention. For maybe it was because of this fact that she had been his enemy all her life, or from the warmth she had gotten from the family she had just met. Her body rushed forward before she even realized it, and she seemed intent on greeting this man. In response, he just looked her way, called her name, and looked the same. Cold stare she was used to in her past life. Even if he feels a familiar energy and suspects something, the guy won't discuss it in public. He'll wait until they can be alone to talk about it. But so far, it is very little to be believed, the place of benevolence and reciprocity. He did not let the girl get too near him, and said he was listening to her intently. In response, Emily was not confused and immediately apologized for the rudeness, and after that, dared to start a conversation without consulting her father. The girl told him that she, personally, wasn't interested in taking him up on his strange offer. Hearing these words and fearing the consequences, her whole family began to tremble with fear and whispered her name. The girl's parents are so outraged that you can tell even by the look in their eyes how displeased they are with her behavior. At the same time, Emily was the only one who wasn't afraid to speak her mind and didn't give in to his manipulation. We can only hope that the girl has thought over her further actions and has done it not only because it is a person she knows. Since the guy expected this meeting and conversation to go in a completely different way, he doesn't even know how to react to it. The only thing he did was smile, but usually someone's smile in these cases can't mean anything good. As expected, the sweet smile immediately turned into a sinister look, but even that was something Emily was used to as well. After that, he kept his eyes on her and said only one word, that her behavior seemed to him no more than merely amusing. The guy isn't taking his interlocutor seriously, and since he's starting to laugh, Emily better apologize and not try to tell him anything more. At this point, he concluded that the girl was not yet familiar with fear. Otherwise, he could not explain this daring act on her part. In response, she had no choice but to simply thank him for those words and continue to pretend that he wasn't going to succeed in scaring anyone, for she, too, could look at him with a sinister look. And if she had a sword, she would be no different from him. And Emily took his words as a compliment. She told him so. It's no wonder that after that, he continued to intimidate her even more. And he did it with a sword, because words don't work anymore. At that moment, he asked how dare the princess of a tiny state stand before the emperor himself. So they have a conflict that gets more and more serious with every response they give. And yet, the main thing the girl plans to find out is whether he really came here to destroy the kingdom and the entire royal family. It's pretty clear to everyone that if he came here to hurt someone or do something bad, the royal family wouldn't be alive. So there must be some explanation or at least a hint as to his intentions in coming here. At some point, he began to scrutinize her appearance more closely and seemed to suspect something. And after that, the most interesting thing happened. The emperor asked the girl to introduce herself and give her real name. And before giving her answer to that question, Emily took her time and thought hard about what he needed the information for. And at that moment, her sisters and mom joined the conversation. They stood up for him and ordered him to get the sword away from Emily. What was most surprising was that, in just a second of this, the girl was thinking of giving Beatrice a name by which he would recognize her at once. It is unknown exactly what answer to that question could have helped her in that situation, and whether it got better after she missed that opportunity and didn't say that very name. Meanwhile, instead of Emily, her sister started talking to the emperor. She ordered them to hide their swords and conduct this dialogue as equals. To each of the royal family, it is maximally uncomfortable to talk to an opponent when they have nothing, and the opponents are fully equipped with swords and many others. As a result, they all began to shout loudly and speak their opinions at the same time, which turned into some strange and unintelligible shouting. Very interesting how the emperor would react to that, because if he really intended to hurt them, he would have done it in the first place. Emily noticed, though it couldn't be seen or unnoticed, the emperor was definitely excited and didn't expect this meeting to happen like this. And at this point, she turned to her family and asked them to calm down, because in this way, they would not be able to solve the problem, but instead would aggravate it. As soon as the girl was heard by her mother, she came up to her daughter and asked how she was feeling. And it's not surprising, because the noise gave her a headache. Very suddenly, her sisters, from whom she had last expected something like this, began to take care of her. Meanwhile, the emperor had a few minutes to calm down and conclude that this was one of the most unusual families he had ever encountered. After that, Emily turned to her mom and told her she was fine, and then said the same thing to her sisters. Since she had no other choice and there was no point in counting on anyone else, she approached the emperor again. and decided to answer his question anew that she was the king's youngest daughter, and her name was Emily. Her relatives watched in silence and for once decided not to interfere with their conversation. Since they had to get out of it somehow, the girl said that if he wasn't planning on destroying them right here, why don't they continue the conversation inside then? Although it is not customary to receive unranked guests in the palace, but for the sake of the emperor, according to the girl, her family agreed to make an exception. In her opinion, this way they could avoid conflict and at least try to make sure they stayed alive as long as possible. Besides, there's never been a diplomatic agreement made in the drive-in palace. Thus, depending on the emperor's answer, it will be possible to understand at once what his intentions are and whether he agrees to continue this dialogue or to compromise in some way. Having created a little pause and intrigue, the emperor did not refuse and agreed to this unexpected proposal. Moreover, he thanked the princess and addressed her by name, which meant that she had improved the situation, even a little. But it was still a good thing. At this point, he ordered the troops to be taken away and warned that no one should disturb him during the coming conversation. Then, the princess invited him to follow her. She decided to escort him into the palace and took matters into her own hands. So she's almost certain that no matter how evil and dangerous this man may seem, it's really not that scary. She still doesn't know what the reason is, but the girl suspects that the emperor doesn't want to destroy their family, or maybe he just can't, which means that these people must have something he needs. It remains to be seen what it is and how expensive it is to her father. Unfortunately, she doesn't have any ideas yet, and it's likely that we'll only find out if we talk, or at the very least, observe that person and constantly reflect on it, because maybe the answer is too obvious. Emily, though she tries not to show it, is actually as worried as she was on the day of their last battle with him. Meanwhile, the emperor is inside the palace, eagerly awaiting the moment they offer him an alternative. As long as they don't risk people or royalty, because someone else's life is their priority. And as usual, some of them couldn't help themselves, and one of the girls started warning that if he dared to hurt anyone again, no one would forgive him. After this, Emily expected an aggressive reaction from his side, but he seems to be so indifferent that he even started to adjust to them and not react to these provocations. After some time, they finally got to the right room, where it would be most pleasant and comfortable to be, discussing so important problems. There are huge, soft, and comfortable couches here, which should affect the atmosphere of this meeting and make this conversation more relaxed, unlike how it began. As soon as the emperor began to assess this room, he immediately said that it was a little cramped, for he had expected something more spacious. In response, to keep the dialogue going, the king smiled slightly and said that, for that, it was very cozy here, despite the lack of a spacious room. Afterward, he motioned him to take a seat, so that at last they could get down to business and agree on what would be advantageous to each of them. The emperor sat on the largest sofa and listened attentively to the king, for it was in his interest to do everything possible to ensure that his family did not suffer as a result. Both sides are well aware that only the emperor has the advantage. He is the one who will have the last word, and he is the one whose decision will be decisive. Even the fact that he agreed to talk to them in a calmer format and didn't launch an attack means something. In an attempt to start this conversation properly, the king greeted the emperor anew and pretended that the previous conversation between them had not taken place. He asked to be allowed to know for what purpose the emperor had come so long to come here, and what result of this meeting he would be satisfied with, and whether it would be a peaceful one. As expected, despite his confidence at this point, the king does not appear to be the same as he seemed when talking during breakfast. Meanwhile, for some unknown reason, but the guy is in no hurry to give an answer to this question, he's thinking it over carefully and doesn't want to rush into it, because every word he says is so important that before you say anything, you have to think about it as seriously as possible. Meanwhile, the girl had momentarily forgotten about the conflict between her father and the emperor. Now she was only interested in one thing. If she were to tell him the truth, how would he react to it, and how would he treat her? And most importantly, would it have any effect on the conflict with the kingdom? So it's also best to take your time and find out why he's here in the first place. At some point, instead of your master, it was his assistant who decided to do it. He provided a document detailing the terms the emperor is offering the king. He calmly left them to the man, and it seemed the moment had come when everything would fall into place, and everyone would speak their final opinion. Meanwhile, as soon as the king took this document, for a few seconds, because of intense fear and responsibility, he could barely make out what it said. As far as they know, all such contracts include unacceptable conditions, and most often, no one signs them and agrees to such things. But the thing is, it's unlikely that the king would dare refuse the emperor, because he knows that the emperor never backs down from his plan and will achieve it by any means necessary. Emily has become so interested in reading this document that she is already barely holding back from joining this conversation. But it's not just because of a lot more determination than her father. For example, she unconsciously wants to talk to this guy and hear his voice, which is why it's hard for her to even restrain herself from looking in his direction and letting him know she's clearly interested in him. But unfortunately, if he suspects her of anything, there's a good chance he'll get it wrong. But at some point, when the girl did look in his direction, she saw that he was also looking at her. But that look was not indifferent at all. His gaze was no longer the same as the way he had originally looked at her, and it seemed to have something to do with his past life. Did he really feel her energy after all? And so he hasn't stopped looking in her direction for at least a few minutes. And surprise, surprise, he's not even trying to hide it. Suddenly, the emperor addressed the princess by name, and at that moment, his voice seemed too special for the girl. It was as if she felt something. She started to look him in the eye, and did it as if her whole life depended on his next sentence. It's such a responsible and unforeseen moment that it's really very difficult to know what to expect from this person. And just as he was ready to say something to her, at that perfect moment, they heard her father's voice, who has already read the contract and is ready to give his opinion on it. I'm very interested to see how he reacts to it, because it's likely that every point in that document was so unacceptable that the king's answer is too obvious. Not once in the history of the kingdom has the king ever signed a contract of any kind, and more often than not, refused to do so without even reading a single clause of it. As suddenly, when everyone was waiting for his answer, the man did not delay the moment and said that the conditions provided were just wonderful, and he has no reason to refuse, much less doubt anything. These words have caused such a surprising reaction that after this, Emily was even more eager to see if the emperor's conditions were really as posh as her father said they were. Watching the reaction, the emperor turned his attention to her and commented that she was clearly confused, and afterward asked her if she did not know how fertile these lands are, and what an inexhaustible source they are. After these words, she had many doubts as to how their fertile lands could be connected with the contract and the reason for his visit. Meanwhile, only the king heard something about his lands as usual, started telling their history, and that their agriculture is the best in the world. Thus they began to praise their kingdom and tell them that they were the best at what they did and never had any worthy competitors. In fact, they do have a lot to be proud of, but that's not what we should be discussing at this moment. The topic of this meeting is completely different. What the girl definitely couldn't expect at this moment was that the emperor would support this conversation and remind her that their kingdom produced a third of the continent's total food supply. Judging by his interest in the subject, the purpose of his visit must be related to the agriculture of the area. Accordingly, the king must have read something like this in the contract. But does he intend to agree to cooperate or give up anything that is his possession for the safety of the kingdom? Gradually, they began to talk more and more on the subject, and even Emily wondered at the extent of the lands her father owned. At one point, the emperor proceeded to recount his knowledge, and it turns out he's been enamored with their activities for quite some time now. He still admires the people here, who are fully committed to their work and do it to the highest possible quality. After that, he looked towards the princess again, and personally started telling her some additional information. Thus he created an awkward situation for her, for the girl of all people should have known about it. In any case, she has only to thank him for it, for she can't tell him the reason why she didn't know it. And yet the most unpleasant thing for her was that the emperor was addressing her as if he were addressing her on purpose, as if she were a little child who knew little of the world. Meanwhile, so as not to waste time in useless talk, the king returned to the business at hand and inquired about why the proposed terms were so good and what the emperor stands to gain from it all. The guy didn't hide the reason and the information that it's all about the wizards. He said, they probably never even realized that this kingdom was the focus of attention of all powerful nations, but the first to notice it were the wizards. And unlike the emperor or other states, they may be interested in the holy might of the kingdom. If it loses, the entire continent will be left without food on a scale never seen before. So if something isn't done in time, much of this world is in for a lot of trouble. That's the purpose of the emperor's visit, and it seems he intends to help, because if the kingdom suffers, everyone else will suffer, including him. Afterward, the king said he had feelings as if this contract was written for a friend rather than a business associate. But instead of the emperor, the question was answered by his assistant. He explained that the man was quite right, for in creating this contract, and the kingdom was seen more as a friend and ally. By signing the contract, they would receive support from the emperor for the next 20 years. As they would be their first country ally, there would be a few additional provisions, but he drew them up in such a way that they were only as supplementary to those already in place. But they won't really affect the kingdom much, so they don't have to worry about it. After listening to the emperor's words, the king looked at his wife, and just from her look, he realized she had nothing against it. Not to wait too long for an answer, the emperor asked if they still had any reason to doubt his proposal. Because as emperor, he guarantees them safety and peace for the next decade at least. Thus, Emily and everyone else finally realized the emperor had suddenly become a universal center of political interest. Accordingly, he had no choice but to find an ally and offer him the most favorable terms. It turns out that, in return, he offers and promises his favor and does his best to avoid his own risks. In any case, the offer is favorable to each of them. The king has no reason to refuse, much less doubt it, because sooner or later, everyone may find themselves in danger, and even then, it will be too late to decide and try to do something. Surprisingly, the king still hasn't said his final decision to finally separate and not waste each other's time. The emperor is trying to hold back, because in this situation, everyone realizes that it's not just up to him anymore. Now he waits for the king's word, not the other way around, as he did some time ago, especially when they first met. He just keeps looking at the princess and making her confused with his stare and ambiguous smile. After that, to finally convince each of them, the guy reminded them that the wizards want to test and break their divine power. With the help of hunger, they want to plunge the whole world into chaos. And if they really want to do it and start doing something, they can achieve their goal anyway. To which the girl replied that did the emperor really expect them to believe him and not begin to doubt the sincerity of the proposal? She doesn't understand how the kingdom can believe the words of a man who invaded the country and waved a sword in their faces. And also, she has an equally important question. If the kingdom is in trouble because of a hastily signed contract, what does he intend to do in such a case? To which the emperor replied that she knew that there was no point in deceiving anyone, especially in such a difficult situation. The girl wondered how he would know whether she believed him or not, for this man had only seen her today. Not surprisingly, after Emily's words, the guy decided to apologize for the manner in which he had shown up here, because they just didn't know what to expect from the kingdom and how they would meet them. He wants to say and remind only one thing. It is a contract of friendship and further cooperation, a good option and beneficial for each of them. Even after saying that, the girl realizes that he's obviously not telling us something and that there's something else behind all those words. All that remains is to figure out how to convince everyone else and make an ordinary princess who doesn't know anything about it believe in such a responsible endeavor. At this point, Emily unfortunately didn't have time to say anything. She was overtaken by her father, who decided to give his consent and sign the contract. The king was immediately supported by his wife and began to rejoice in this decision, as if it gave some guarantee of their safety. which their daughter very much doubts. In the opinion of the man, it would be wrong of them to refuse, which is perhaps a very great mistake. The emperor replied that he was very grateful for their understanding and inclination to cooperate, for this was far more important than it might seem at first sight. Very much wondering whether the king's assent is a mistake and whether his daughter's fears about it are justified, Emily is the only one who's up for anything, unlike her family, because she knows this person, that he could turn out to be completely different from who he really is. She is certain he cannot be trusted, much less sign any contracts that concern the safety and further future of the kingdom. But that's not the best part. After this conversation, the emperor did say the most important thing, which is that, as emperor, he would like to choose one of the king's daughters as his future wife, and this is an additional condition that he has decided to voice only now. So he has 4 choices of which of the girls he'd like to cast, if they're okay with it. I really wonder how their father would react, and if he would even agree to such a condition. Not surprisingly, after hearing this, one could not expect any other reaction than surprise and complete incomprehension of how this relates to the problem under discussion. As it turned out, even his assistant couldn't imagine his master planning something like this. This was the first time the guy had heard such a condition, and marveled at it as much as each of the king's daughters, for the emperor had not even explained why it was so important or what it had to do with the case. Without thinking long, the king rose from the sofa, looked into the eyes of the emperor, and decided to ask if he really hadn't overheard him, that the emperor wants one of his daughters to marry him, because there was no mention of it in the contract. Well, the guy replied that everything was absolutely correct, and now, on his part, all the conditions for a contract are laid out. In fact, the girl was even glad for this reaction from her father, and began to hope that he would respond properly to this man and refuse to accept the offer. It only depends on what the man chooses, and whether he is willing to give up one of his daughters, for his own benefit and the benefit of the kingdom. Instead of outrages and whatnot, the king turned to his wife and began to rejoice that one of his daughters would marry the emperor, as he had dreamed all his life. Meanwhile, the girl started talking about the topic and choosing the one who was most suitable for the role, and there were some problems with that. One of them, some guy's about to propose, so there's no way she's going to break up with her lover. Afterward, another girl offered herself for the nomination. She is quite free and would not refuse to marry him. In the opinion of the third of them, the emperor is not so good that she would like to consider him as her future husband. She is not interested in him at all. But at this point, they've completely forgotten about the fourth girl, Emily. She's the only one who's thinking straight and realizes the consequences. Knowing this man, she has no intention of trusting him, and is not even considering such an option to claim to be his wife. At that moment, she decided to pull herself together, because one of them could be married off any minute. So, she turned to the emperor again and warned that he should be more careful in making such important decisions. To which the guy replied that he was surprised at her reaction, since no one else but her sees any problem with the proposal. Emily turned around and realized that no one would even think of supporting her in this situation, because for each of them, what was happening was like some kind of joyous event. Without asking the king's opinion, the emperor said that if he chooses a woman to spend the rest of his life with, he should observe her for a while before making a decision. So he plans to stay in the kingdom for a few months. He intends to get to know them better, and only after that, he can make his choice. But it seems only Emily is not ready for it. I wonder if she is suggesting that she is the one the emperor sees as the prime candidate. After he said that, he looked her in the eye and let her know that she was the girl he wanted to be around. It turns out that the only purpose of his visit to this kingdom was to find a wife for him, and perhaps the talk of wizards and danger was made up. The next day came. The girl happened to walk into some room and saw something that raised too many questions in her mind. She saw a great many helpers starting to move furniture around the room, and it seems that preparations for some kind of event were taking place. She's very curious about who ordered them to do it and what's going on, since no one has ever told her anything. At that moment, she heard someone's footsteps, and that person was the emperor. He greeted the girl and asked her why she was so much surprised. The girl looked at him and reciprocated, but still couldn't say anything back to him, because she doesn't understand how she should react to it. She just looks him in the eye and tries to figure out from his gaze whether or not he has something to do with what's going on. A few hours earlier, when they were still talking of marriage and accepting the new terms of the girl was not shy and asked him why he needed someone from that family, for there were more enticing prospects where he came from. The emperor did not deny this, and explained that one of the advantages of being emperor was being able to do whatever he wanted and however he wanted to do it. It remains to be seen what he needs and what he really wants, and how her family can be helpful in achieving his goals. Because it is possible that one of the sisters has long liked the emperor, and for this reason, this meeting cannot deny the fact that the girls are really very beautiful and could interest even the emperor. In any case, the girl is sure he has something to hide, and it remains only to understand what it is connected with and what he really wants. The emperor, she knew, paid no attention to relationships with girls, no matter how charming and gorgeous they were. There was even a time when Emily thought that he was not interested in women at all, and so she began to suspect him that marriage was only an attempt to hide his real intention. The emperor still stares at everyone as if he's hiding something. At least unlike the others, Emily can see it very well. After her remarks, since they had cleared up the misunderstanding, the guy asked permission to continue his speech. He turned to his assistant and tried to do his best to confirm his intention to stay here. The emperor asked him to send the knights back, in addition to the guards, and also asked him to bring everything he might need for a comfortable stay here. And most importantly, he asked him to also head back, for the emperor would not be in place, and the aide would be perfectly capable of replacing him. He couldn't refuse and gladly agreed to replace the emperor for a while. He understands perfectly well that they really have no other choice. At this moment, Emily had a suspicious feeling as if the emperor was purposely trying to get rid of his aide, and it made her very nervous. As a result, with every word he says, she has less and less reason to trust him, and more desire to find out what he's interested in and why he's here after all.